Hey there, we are here today to talk about preparing for, thinking about everything that could happen with supply chain disruptions. And we aren't just talking about pandemics here. Every organization has unique perspective on how COVID, hurricanes, natural disasters affect their own supply chains. So to be ready for whatever disruption happens to be next, we're going to talk with Brent Roeder. I went to look up Brent's safety qualifications, and I found that there were too many to list. You would literally fall asleep if I read you the whole list. So I'll just mention that Brent is a QSSP with his areas of focus include maximizing site safety and productivity. So Brent, thank you for sharing your time with us.
Kurt, thanks for having me.
So, when we talk about strengthening a safety supply chain, how can people get started? We want to make sure that we cut down on disruptions. So, what's the very first thing they can do to mitigate some of the risk that's in their supply chain?
So, Kurt, I think there's really two things, right? So, the first part about it is really how you build the team out. You you find sometimes when you're trying to get a group of people together to make decisions, you struggle with including too many people or having just a finite group of individuals make a decision, and not maybe necessarily having the full scope. So for us, when we look at it, or when I've built teams in the past, it has to involve someone from logistics, procurement. We're talking about safety today, and that's obviously a critical aspect of the business. You have to have an executive sponsor, and I think that you have to realize and understand who the other parties are, like your supply chain, the manufacturers that you buy from, or the people that help you get it there. Again, with the logistics, to make sure that you have the right people involved, so you can make good decisions. And I think that once you get that team together, the piece that's most important is to truly understand what creates value. What is it that are your non-negotiables, the things you can't live without? And then the executive sponsor or the people who are the decision makers in the room really have to give the authority and autonomy to the people who are members of that team to make decisions in real time. I think that one of the things that you learn from any kind of disruption, whether it's a fire or a hurricane or whether it's COVID, is that the constraints that are put in place really do affect the ability for people to access those durable goods that they might need. And so being able to make those decisions in real time definitely helps out your supply chain a lot.
I think it would be easy too to confuse mitigating risk with eliminating risk. And that's not actually what I feel like you're suggesting. I think more along the ways we're talking about the fact that there will always be risk in a supply chain, but people should be looking to give themselves options for when a disruption does occur. Am I right there?
So there's definitely people in the safety community who would argue that you can eliminate all risk. But what I think the way that I would think about it is if you're comparing like a serious injury or fatality to a first aid occurrence, right? When you're looking at the things that occur within some of these supply chain constraints, you have to be able to prioritize what are those most serious parts of your supply chain. And you want to be able to kind of be able to deal with what you can define as the known possibilities once you've built that team. I really like the idea of taking the same approach kind of risk ranking your supply chain and again, determining what's truly critical. I'd use an example of if you're a manufacturing facility, protecting against chemicals that you work with on a day-to-day basis would be something that would be a non-negotiable where you have to have the right components to protect your workers to continue to keep your production process open. And so one of the ways that we've seen people mitigate but not eliminate the risk is to define the programs based around a standard or a specification and not hard spec in a given manufacturer or a given product, right? So if I said to you, I need a disposable garment that meets a specific standard rather than specing in a brand and a SKU, it gives your people who are making decisions in real time the ability to identify products that might be fit for use, but might not be the exact brand that you're most used to procuring through your normal supply chain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that fits. And I like the clarification there. I do believe that there are people who would say you can eliminate all risk. It feels to me like uh, one thing that we're really thinking about here is having options is a great way to prepare for your organization to be ready for the unknown. Let's say that a natural disaster just hit. What do people need to do to be ready for that type of a situation?
So, Kurt, I'm going to assume that you've got your plan in place and you've identified who your team members are and you've had those conversations. You have a process, right? So now's the time to really make sure that practice that you've put into play is something that can actually run when you need it. So it's getting the team together, it's putting the plan in action, it's contacting your stakeholders who might work outside of the four walls or the virtual four walls of your business, if you will. And then I think that it's establishing clear commitments with each one of those people to define the tasks of what they need to do and then what's most critical, right? So it's these are the three things that we have to do today. That there's non-negotiables for us to make sure that we're taking care of our business. We're going to contact our suppliers and make sure that they know that we've reached a critical point within our supply chain, and we need them to step up and do the things they've committed to. Procurement may need to take specific roles. Your logistics teams may need to make sure that you've got fleet vehicles or third-party brokers that you're going to work with to make sure that you can get the product where you actually need it to do the greatest good to help people. And then you just have to deliver on what you said you were going to do for your people. It's really sometimes that simple and that direct.
It's just taking action, and that just makes sense. The thing that you kind of, I think you were hinting at it. Maybe you were giving me a perfect segue here. I'm not sure. What about communication? How big of a deal is communicating during a, let's call it a supply chain event?
So if you broke it down kind of before, during, and after, Kurt, you'd say, before is obviously building the plan and focusing your resources, narrowing down what you try and tackle, right? So if it's a disaster where you need generators and water, trying not to get scope creep and get everything that you might possibly need for every disaster. If that's a hurricane, for example, making sure that you have that plan put in place for those specific needs is kind of the before part of it. I think communicating during is so incredibly important. And when you think about it, it shouldn't be, in some cases, probably, even as simple as it shouldn't be a cell phone. There should be shared resources, documents, or pages where people can go and get the information that they need easily. I'll tell you that things like smart sheets and things like Microsoft Teams have become incredibly valuable to us in managing some of those situations. You can use a phone to do those things, but you can also use Wi-Fi, and there's kind of a greater scope of resources available, especially when you know that pandemics can tax all of our infrastructure. And I think off the back end of that kind of communication is having a plan for returning to normal. If we look at the situations that we're in right now, it's making sure that you don't have too much of what you needed during the pandemic or during that critical time. It's making sure that if you do, that you understand what you're going to do with those resources. And then off the back end of it, I think anybody who's running any kind of a program like this tries to find lessons learned. I would tell you that during COVID, one of the things that I'm most proud of, and one of the things that I think we saw in lots of different companies, was there was such a sense of understanding between everybody in those discussions. There was a willingness to try and find new ways to do things, and there was such a small amount of people trying to cast blame. And it was so refreshing, and it was so uplifting to see people who were really trying to use that after opportunity or use those moments to determine what we can do better through each stage of the pandemic. And I think that will really allow us to take what we've learned and really get better each time we try and do this, so that we can take care of the people who are involved in these pandemics or natural disasters, which is really the end goal.
I think that the pandemic just put a spotlight on how fragile some supply chains could be. I don't think that anybody was expecting to run out of toilet paper. And then the list just goes on and on when you start thinking about all the things that were talked about in the media. What was the strongest supply chain out there? The ones that you probably didn't hear about. So I'm going to put you to the test now. Thinking about this past huge global disruption, what was your biggest lesson learned from the recent disruptions?
That's not an easy question to answer, Kurt. Right? I would. Um, so I think the biggest lesson learned from the recent disruption was how interconnected the supply chain is, how upstream challenges to our supply chain can continue to echo throughout a really, really long period of time, how increased demand for materials and labor shortages, whether it be a shutdown in labor, um, or whether it just be, a natural disaster that strikes that limits our access to raw materials. Um, the interconnectivity of it all was probably the greatest lesson that I've learned. And the takeaway from it was really about how those who are willing to commit to a process we're so much further ahead than their peer group. That plan that they have in place and their willingness to act on it in a timely and concise fashion really became a true force multiplier for those businesses. And I think that it'll benefit them for years to come as they come out of it stronger and more able to return to, I hate to call it normal, but to a state of business that has significantly less disruption in it.
So I feel like this is just a completely out of the blue one that I think you're going to have an answer for me on. When we think about chainsaw oil, why was that affected during the pandemic?
Gosh, I would tell you I'm definitely not a chainsaw oil expert, Kurt, but it could be everything from the plastic utilized to manufacture the bottles that the chainsaw oil is sold in, right? It could be, there could have been a singular component in there that had a constraint on the supply chain. It could have been a storm that hit Dallas in Louisiana that shut disruption. We saw a significant percentage of our cutting fluids. We saw raw materials components that had two or three steps removed from a single oil-based component in it get completely disrupted. If you look at the way that chips in vehicles are affecting the value of used cars today, it's two or three steps removed. But I think that all of those instances really show us how interconnected we all are. And really, if you would have known that you were, one of the large car manufacturers and you were going to have a shortage 3 years ago because you had a plan in place, man, you'd be sitting pretty good right now.
That is so true. And you're speaking my language because I'm going to look at a minivan tonight. Hooray, parenthood.
Good luck.
So, Brent, again, thank you for your time. Yes, we're excited. We're excited. But that's another thing. I feel like I have taken enough of your time, and it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much.
Great to catch up. Thanks for the time, Kurt.